Russia thinks it has the perfect strategy that will finally see it take the key Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. It believes that Ukraine can't do anything about this strategy as Russia's forces attempt to surround the city and in the process take several other settlements that will only speed up Pokrovsk's fall. Russia has unleashed the pincer on a city close to Pokrovsk, but it never saw Ukraine turning that very strategy against it to reinforce the very city that Russia wants to encircle. Ukraine's genius Frontline trick made amazing use of the pincer to provide its troops with some much-needed breathing room. Though Pokrovsk is Russia's main goal here, Ukraine's remarkable flipping of the Russian script instead focused on the Dobropilia front line, particularly the region above Myrnohrad. In that region, Russia is attempting to create a pincer that will allow it to take Myrnohrad, which in turn would give it another route toward Pokrovsk as it attempts to encircle the battered city. Russia was close to completing the pincer move. By November 13th, the New York Times was reporting that the pincer was close to being closed, as there was only a 2-mile-wide gap left open that Ukraine's troops could use to exit Myrnohrad. If that gap closed, Ukraine's troops would be trapped. Pincer movements are simple in concept, though they are extremely difficult to pull off. Changing minds explains the basics of the move. An attacking country sends out 2 columns, one to the right of an enemy position and the other to the left. You can substitute right and left for north and south, east and west, or whatever directions you want. The point is that the pincer creates a situation in which the enemy troops are forced to fight a battle on 2 fronts. As the pincer is completed, the attacking troops turn in and push forward, hitting the pocket they've created and killing everything inside. Russia is very familiar with this particular strategy. The battle for Stalingrad, though devastating for Russia in terms of casualties, was also a battle that the country won. And it won that battle, Changing Minds says, because it pulled off a pincer that saw Russia's forces surround 250,000 German soldiers. Slowly but surely, Russia tightened the noose on German soldiers, attacking from all sides, while also taking its time as it starved them out. By the time the German forces surrendered, they numbered just 91,000, meaning 159,000 lost their lives to Russia's pincer. Russia's goal is to pull off something similar, though on a much smaller scale, in Myrnohrad. That makes Ukraine's goal simple: stop them. Euromaidan Press says that Ukraine has gone a long way to doing just that, in a move that it describes as coming directly from Ukrainian command. What the country just pulled off may be the most important counter in the entire Pokrovsk campaign, the outlet says, at least when it comes to defending the city ahead of the cold winter months that could make future Russian assaults much weaker. And it all started near the Ukrainian settlement of Rodynske. That town is another target for Russia as it tries to take Pokrovsk. Euromaidan Press's November 14th report says that Russia's drone operators were the next target. Aerial reconnaissance conducted over Rodynske allowed Ukraine to identify the drone operators that had been successfully avoided just days before attempting to set up a base in a mine to the east of Rodynske. Those operators didn't last long. Ukraine ordered an Su-27 to drop an American-made GBU-62 JDAM bomb on the site, obliterating it in an instant. The JDAM was the perfect choice for this attack, a guided air-to-surface kit that can be attached to bombs weighing up to 2,000 pounds, according to the US Navy. The JDAM delivers a heavy payload that is ideal for destroying hardened structures and bunkers. Once released from the aircraft, the JDAM uses a laser, GPS, or both to navigate to its target. The weapon is so accurate that it has an error of below 20 feet, and Ukraine has the option of launching several of them at once to hit targets hard. It didn't need to do that against Rodynske's drone operators. 1 JDAM was enough for them. However, Ukraine deployed a second of those powerful guided bombs moments later. With the drone operators dealt with, Ukraine's surveillance team discovered another grouping of Russia's soldiers on Rodynske's outskirts. Those soldiers were attempting to fortify a building, perhaps intending to use it as a launch pad for an incursion deeper into the town. They never had the chance. Another airstrike featuring a JDAM was ordered, which Euromaidan Press claims not only destroyed the fortifications, but also took out several officers leading the raids into the town. Ukraine wasn't done there. Militarny says that Russia was also trying to sneak some of its soldiers into Rodynske as all of this was happening. Those soldiers attempted to regroup in a building. Ukraine came after them, taking advantage of dense fog and an armored vehicle to knock out the Russian soldiers. Russian forces had managed to get tanks into Rodynske, the outlet says, and the occupiers were also using first-person view or FPV drones to provide those tanks with cover. Ukraine's strategy in this initial assault was to go in under the cover of fog, which makes it harder for FPV drone operators to do their work. Ukraine then took out the Russian forces along with the tanks that had snuck into Rodynske. The fog strategy worked. More Russian soldiers were discovered in an industrial complex in the town, and they were also taken out with JDAMs. Russia's electronic warfare devices managed to send the first guided bomb that Ukraine launched off course, but a second hit its mark, and Russia's troops were finally pushed out of Rodynske. The town was safe, for now. But Ukraine was a long way from being out of the woods, as Russia's forces were still trying to form their pincer around Myrnohrad. Russia likely thought that Ukraine had lost sight of that pincer due to being so focused on Rodynske. The reality was that Ukrainian airstrikes were just a prelude to an extremely clever maneuver that Russia never anticipated, a fake attack. With its success in Rodynske, Ukraine realized that it had momentum, and momentum brings with it opportunity, which is something that Russia's forces would have realized as well. Taking advantage of Russia's fear of a new assault, Ukraine created a simulated attack that made it seem as though its forces were trying to launch an assault against Russia's troops from all sides, Euromaidan press reports. A sort of reversal of the pincer, only with Ukraine snapping the trap shut. The troops were deployed and movements were made to give Russian surveillance enough reason to believe that an attack was coming. That achieved two things for Ukraine. First, it placed Russia's forces on the defensive. Having launched a failed assault at Rodynske, they started backtracking so they could fortify the impending Ukrainian waves. Second, that backtracking also meant that Russia gave up on its attempts to reach soldiers that Ukraine had already encircled, leaving those troops stranded and vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. Russia was playing a game of numbers and thought that it could defend against the assault Ukraine was preparing. In doing so, it would whittle down the Ukrainian numbers and, if Putin had his way, launch another attack on Rodynske to bring Russia's pincer move closer to completion. Ukraine watched all of Russia's moves unfold. Then it made the move Russia didn't expect. Ukraine started rotating its forces in the embattled Myrnohrad. Russia was concentrating all of its attention on the Dobropilia direction that Ukraine seemed to be heading in, which meant the country's forces took their eyes away from the main goal of their entire operation. With Russia distracted, Ukraine started extracting wounded personnel out of Myrnohrad while cycling fresh soldiers into the city. Supplies and ammunition were also sent into Myrnohrad, giving the troops that Russia was trying to trap in its pincer what they needed to punch holes in the Russian advance. It was a textbook deception maneuver. Create pressure on one sector, force the enemy to divert reserves, and use the gained window to reinforce or extract troops from another direction, Euromaidan press reports. And Russia fell for it hook, line, and sinker. None of this is to say that the counterattack Ukraine used to distract Russia's forces was completely fake. Ukraine legitimately sent troops to the north of Rodynske, which was a vital part of the plan. Those soldiers were never going to seriously engage with Russia's forces, but they needed to be visible to Russian surveillance to give the impression that Ukraine was launching an assault. As those soldiers tricked the occupiers, Ukraine deployed evacuation convoys into Myrnohrad under the protection of electronic countermeasures. Those convoys both evacuated wounded soldiers and delivered fresh supplies to Ukraine's troops in the city. Refreshed and with new blood among their ranks, Ukraine's Myrnohrad defenders are now ready to hold the line, where they were once on the brink of collapsing under Russia's pressure. And the most incredible thing about the entire operation is also the most humiliating for Putin and his forces. Russia fell for this trick so completely that Ukraine managed to pull it off without losing a single soldier. Ukraine delivered a healthy dose of salt into the Russian wound by also using Russia's offensive in Pokrovsk against it. Remember, we told you that Ukraine was simulating a pincer move of its own. As you learned earlier in the video, that sort of move requires forces to approach from two sides to surround an enemy. The soldiers who headed north from Rodynske covered the first side, tying down Russia's reserves in Dobropilia in the process. As for Pokrovsk, Ukraine didn't need to do much. It was already tying down Russian forces in that direction. Much like with Rodynske, Russia's forces had been trying to take Pokrovsk. On November 11th, BBC reported that Russia had managed to move deeper into Pokrovsk under the cover of fog, seemingly employing the same tactic Ukraine used to avoid Russia's FPV drones in Rodynske. More recently, after Ukraine had pulled off its genius trick, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty reported that Russia had launched an overnight attack against Pokrovsk on November 15th. An aerial assault involving 135 drones and 3 missiles was launched at the city, though 2 of the missiles and all but 41 of the drones were taken out. Ukraine reported no casualties in that recent attack. However, the point we're making here is that a massive contingent of the forces that Russia might have been able to use to figure out that Ukraine was faking its attempt at its own pincer never noticed a thing because they were too wrapped up in the battle for Pokrovsk. All Ukraine had to do was hold Russia south of the railway line that leads into Pokrovsk, and the illusion was complete. In other words, Ukraine had to ensure that Pokrovsk didn't fall if it was to execute its strategy in Myrnohrad. If Pokrovsk had fallen, that would have meant thousands of Russian troops could advance on Rodynske and Myrnohrad, and the Ukrainian deception would have fallen apart. Coordination was key in all of this, as Euromaidan press explains. Ukrainian troops are thus not only defending two towns but coordinating between them in a way that keeps both strategically viable and linked through controlled logistics corridors, the outlet notes in its report on Ukraine's deceptive strategy. Perhaps Putin will see the irony of this. His single-minded focus on taking Pokrovsk, which has led him to committing the majority of the soldiers that he has in the Donetsk region to the city, is the very thing that allowed Ukraine to reinforce Myrnohrad. And that brings us to what happens next in the Donetsk direction. Does what Ukraine just pulled off mean that Myrnohrad is safe? Well, it depends on how you define that term. Myrnohrad certainly isn't safe in the sense that Russia has magically stopped attacking the city. Ukraine has pulled off a creative deception that allowed it to reinforce the city, but it didn't break the Russian pincer. That was never the goal. If it were, then the fake attack Ukraine launched would have been a real attack, and a massive battle would have ensued. However, Myrnohrad may now be safe in the sense that Russia is very unlikely to take the city before the freezing cold Ukrainian winter truly beds in. We mentioned near the beginning of the video that holding out until the mercury plummets was Ukraine's main goal with its trick. That time is coming up quickly. January is only a month and a half away, and according to WeatherSpark, that month brings with it the cold that may stop Russia's attempted Myrnohrad pincer in its tracks. The city's cold season starts in mid-November and lasts until the start of March, with temperatures averaging just 37.4 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius during that entire 3.5-month period. In January, Myrnohrad has an average high of 25 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 4 degrees Celsius, and the temperatures can drop as low as just 13 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 11 degrees Celsius. Ukraine needs to hold out until then. Russia's assaults will slow down as the weather gets colder, and the fake pincer has just allowed Ukraine to reinforce its Myrnohrad defenses at a critical juncture in the battle for Donetsk. Myrnohrad is now being encompassed in a multi-layered Ukrainian strategy that includes Dobropilya and Pokrovsk. Ukraine is looking to contain Russia's advance, Euromaidan Press says, and what it just achieved will help because the reinforcements and supplies that just entered Myrnohrad have transformed the city into a fortress right at the point where Ukraine's defenses were at risk of breaking. Ukraine likely doesn't expect to hold Myrnohrad or Pokrovsk, for that matter, forever. But what it will do, as Euromaidan Press explains, is force Russia into another slow, attritional fight that costs thousands of lives for minimal territorial gain. Holding the railway in Pokrovsk that Ukraine can use to keep Myrnohrad supplied is a key to that strategy. Ukraine will focus its defenses on that line as much as possible, leading into the coldest months of the year. Then it'll take advantage of the Russian slowdown to strengthen Myrnohrad further, creating the conditions for yet more Russian attrition. And attrition is the last thing that Putin wants in his push for a city that has already cost Russia so much. We mentioned earlier that Pokrovsk is Putin's ultimate goal in all of this. Taking Rodynske moves Russia closer to Pokrovsk, and the same applies to Myrnohrad. But the constant Russian pushes toward Pokrovsk have cost Russia dearly, both during the vaunted summer offensive that ultimately failed to take Pokrovsk and during the months before, when Russia was throwing its troops at a city that at times seemed unbreakable. Russia's Pokrovsk losses are extensive. On November 16th, The Sun said that Putin has thrown almost 200,000 soldiers into the 18-month-long Pokrovsk meat grinder, and most of those soldiers have been spit right back out. The outlet claims that at least 135,000 of the almost 200,000 have been killed or injured in the lengthy battle for the Ukrainian stronghold. Ukraine's Myrnohrad move should ensure that number rises throughout the winter and into 2026, assuming the country can hold on until the freezing temperatures arrive. The Sun quotes the UK's Philip Ingram, who is the former NATO planner and British intelligence officer, when delivering its casualty rate. Some Ukrainian figures suggest in the battle for Pokrovsk alone, 135,000 troops have been killed or wounded. It could be more, Ingram tells The Sun before going on to explain what this rate of attrition will mean for Putin's wider push to take the entire Donbass region. And we know to try and capture through the whole of the area of the disputed Donbass, British military intelligence or defense intelligence has suggested at current advance rates it would take another 4 years and 2 million Russian casualties, Ingram adds. The intelligence that Ingram mentions seems to be backed by a combination of trench art writer David Axe and a United 24 media report from recent comments made by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Axe said on October 6th that Russia suffered as many as 100,000 casualties during the first 9 months of 2025, while trying to take Pokrovsk. November 7th saw United 24 media report on claims that Zelensky made that Russia suffered confirmed losses of 25,000 soldiers that were caught on video, and likely up to 3,000 more besides during October. Most of those losses were in the Pokrovsk direction, which will create a 2025 total of up to 128,000 casualties near that city alone, up to the beginning of November. Add the other 9 months that Putin has pushed for Pokrovsk into the mix, and Ingram's offhand suggestion of it could be more when sharing his 135,000 figure for the entire campaign may be more accurate than even he realizes. Again, none of this means that Russia won't eventually take Pokrovsk. Ukraine likely expects it to do so, which is why it's working on inflicting as many losses against Putin's forces as possible before that day comes. And even when, or if, Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad are occupied by Russia, the victory may not be as sweet as Putin hopes. Yes, Ukraine will suffer a massive blow to its morale due to the loss of one of its strongest fortress cities. The Telegraph even suggests that this blow may be heavy enough to shatter Ukrainian unity, if the country allows that to happen. However, the same outlet points out that Russia taking Pokrovsk will actually have a negligible impact on the frontline dynamics in Donetsk, making the morale blow the biggest one that Ukraine has to prepare for. That viewpoint is echoed by Mark Galeotti in a November 15th piece for The Times. As the defense of Pokrovsk and the neighboring town of Myrnohrad collapses, the fighting in northeastern Ukraine will continue, Galeotti points out. The fortress cities of the remaining Ukrainian part of the Donetsk region still stand. Western observers believe they will take longer to fall than Pokrovsk. Russia is at 18 months and counting with Pokrovsk. Thanks to Ukraine's deceptive Myrnohrad move, we may well see that number of months taken extend into the 20s. If Russia has to spend even more time than that on the rest of Ukraine's fortress cities, Putin may well churn through his troops and equipment long before the Ukrainian resistance fades. That's why what Ukraine just did in Myrnohrad is so important. It makes a battle that has already been a slog for Russia even longer, meaning Ukraine will have more time to prepare defenses for the cities to which Putin next turns his attention if Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad fall. Some might even argue that Ukraine is breaking Russia and not the other way around. We certainly did in a recent video where we looked at why Putin is rejecting peace and how Ukraine is making him pay for it. Check out that video to learn more, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk situations. And thank you for watching.